I've had that happen before.
All right, how's everybody doing? Want to start? All right, since there's such a small audience, we will keep this formula. We'll keep this informal. I needed a couple of seconds here. I want to talk to you about how we do applied research here at FIEA, right? We have a very interesting program here, and it forces us to do some sort of things out of the norm for academia, right? So I gotta set this up by talking a little bit of a story, right? Every good presentation has a story. So I started here 3 years ago. The executive director and I both live in Winter Park. I ran into him at the Publix, and he goes, "Hey, what are you doing?" Because my son was on his son's baseball team, and long story, I have a job for you, right? And what was happening was he was getting pressure. We had new regime here on, as a graduate program, how do we bring more of a research focus to the program? So currently, my mission here is how do we bring more opportunities for our students outside the traditional entertainment industry? And I'm hoping that most of you are aware that FIEA has a very successful graduate program producing game developers, game producers, artists for AAA titles in the entertainment industry, except for that person right there. But we hadn't done much in terms of the modeling and simulation community here. So when I started here, I had a charge of, hey, let's see if we can get something going in the medical simulation, military simulation, ed tech sort of space on doing this. I got to make sure I get the story straight because it's been here. So that was kind of my very broad mission. So as you start to survey going on here, you come, as opposed to many grad programs that, like I was when I was in graduate school, graduate research assistants were like the last of the formal caste system. You were there to earn your stipend, get your 9 credit hours, and do whatever the professor wanted to. And I come here expecting an experience similar to when I was in grad school, and lo and behold, there's no experience like that because we are a market rate lockstep program and actively discourage the students here from getting part-time jobs. So we don't have students. So our program, or a typical program, is research focused with tenure track faculty, and there's some curriculum flexibility. I remember the summer of my grad school, I had an opportunity to go work as a strategic planner at digital equipment in Maynard for vice president. I was all registered to finish in the summer, and hey, I can just throw that out the window and go work at Maynard in outside of Boston for the summer and finish my grad school in the fall, because there was flexibility at how you set up classes. FIEA is not that way. FIEA has, and Tom, as one of the faculty member here, can get into that a little bit more. We have a very structured program that gets the student out with skills as quickly as possible. So our program is professionally focused with professors of practice. Tom's a leader in the game industry, runs a 60-person game studio here in town, times at Microsoft and EA. Most all the faculty here, except me, have experience in the game industry. So they're not researchers per se. And I talked about the lockstep program. So what this has, when you're trying to get external partnerships going, I don't have much to work with, right? I don't have a cadre of grad students. Since they're professionally focused, they don't necessarily have a research agenda that's going out and getting grants. So, you know, what's someone to do? So how did this come about? In 2 words, networking and coincidence. I was talking to Tom one day about, you know, my GameLab class is coming up, and I'm looking for projects to give my students, and Tom can tell you, Tom's part of this is to talk a little bit more about GameLab as a class. You know, where am I going to find projects? At the same time, I happen to be on the ITSIG, if you guys know what ITSIG is, the Military Simulation Education Training and Technology Conference here, and I'm on the Serious Games Committee there. One of the people that I know from the committee is the Assistant Director of Game Development for the VA, for their training, and she's talking about, God, we have this problem, and we don't have people that we could apply to this problem. We'd just like to test this out. So lo and behold, just like a Reese's commercial, peanut butter and chocolate are put together, and I go to Tom and say, hey, we have this opportunity at the VA, and that's sort of the genesis of where you'll see Michael's application, because there's a thread to this, where this started. I think you come on now. You come on now, right? Mm-hmm. All right.
You put an awkward picture of me up there, and then we move on.
That's right.
So the history of GameLab predates Erik, actually. But the history of GameLab being good doesn't predate Erik. Erik made it better.
Thank you.
We started this in cohort 10, so that doesn't mean much to you guys. That's we're about to accept cohort 16 into the building, and so it's been going for 5 years. So we've had 5 years worth of classes. And in the beginning, the reason that we made the change to go to a GameLab style class in the spring was because we were noticing more and more of our students and our alumni were either transitioning into other fields besides entertainment, or they were even starting there. Like, they were getting jobs at Lockheed Martin locally and at other places. And it wasn't just military simulation, it was medical simulation, it was games in the workplace, it was games in advertising. It was a lot of different scenarios that our students were going to get work in that were not related to AAA games for entertainment, but using games technology and the stuff they were learning at FIEA to land really good, stable, high-paying jobs as leaders in other areas, okay? So when we saw that happening, it was like, how can we kind of encourage that? Because it was good for us and our placement rate. Right? It was like, it's nice that we're seeing students hitting multiple fields. We weren't just beholden to like the EA and Epic and those kind of companies now. All of a sudden, we've got a reasonable contingent going to Lockheed Martin and making a good salary. And it was like, how can we encourage this? And we decided to create a class where we force them to kind of live in that world. We say, okay, what's different between making games for entertainment and making games in that world? One of the key differences that I saw right away is this notion of the people making the games aren't the experts in the game they're making. Like, they're making a game and applying technology, but we're marrying people that know a lot about the subject matter that the games are on with the gaming technologies and the gaming sort of acumen of gamification and things like that. But we were seeing where that relationship between, say, a doctor and a game maker was really successful, where the doctor could give, some information about the particular thing they wanted to put into a game. The gamers could give, hey, here's how you do this in a gaming world. And the doctor loved it, the gaming people loved it, and we made great products that were really strong. So that became a cornerstone of my class, is this notion of an SME, a subject matter expert. So you have to get with an outside person who's going to give you a subject that you don't know really anything about, or you may know something about, but they are the expert in the field, and now you have to make a game with them, and they have to have an idea. So the challenge is finding those SMEs that are interested in engaging with the class and in motivating students to want to work on games that are not in their field and that are not for entertainment purposes. So it's kind of a challenging class to run, because I've got unmotivated students and I've got to track down SMEs and sort of corral them and keep them going. So it's definitely a challenge from that perspective. Where we see, can you go back to that other slide?
Yeah, sure.
Where we see most of the other stuff coming in is like military training, advertising, medical simulation, education are like the places where I'm kind of targeting. And usually projects will fit into one of those buckets. Can you go to the next slide?
Yep.
So, what's different about working with an SME? A ton. Like prior to this, FIEA students weren't ever working with an SME. They got to decide what game they made. They were the expert in it. Then they would make it, they would make changes, they would iterate, and all of that stuff, just like we do in the game industry. Well, now all of a sudden you have somebody over here with like a learning objective or something along those lines. And you've got game developers that don't know anything about that, but they know a lot about their field. So now you've got to have tons of communication, and the communication patterns are unlike what game developers are used to, where they're talking game stuff. Now all of a sudden they're hearing about weird words and stuff like that. Meanwhile, the doctors are used to talking to other doctors, so they're used to talking to people who understand the basics. So it's an education for them as well to kind of like understand what it's like to work with a team that is ready to give you what you need, but they don't speak your language. So that's what we're up against. What I found in the very early stages of this, I believe it or not, I didn't really recognize this whole subject matter expert stuff until about year 2 or 3. So when I first started doing it, the class was basically, you have to make a game outside your field and you have to figure out what that is. That was kind of what I charged them with, right? So we ended up with students like, for example, hey, I used to work part-time at SeaWorld, and I know a dolphin trainer that always wanted to make a game. So I'm gonna go ask that dolphin trainer if they'll work with us. Okay, so they would form a team, and now I've got the 5-person dolphin training team that's working with a SeaWorld trainer, okay? And eventually, I ended up with 2 or 3 of those styles that were actually pretty good, and then I'd end up with a bunch of students that were working with like themselves and saying, I always wanted to make a Spanish game, and so we're gonna make a Spanish game designed for a Spanish classroom. But they didn't have somebody that was a teacher. They had somebody that knew Spanish, right? So they made something. I had chemistry games, but not with chemistry teachers, but just students that wanted to make a chemistry game like that. I found that looking at the products, it was very apparent that the products that had the outside SME, the legitimate SME, were way better than the internally sourced SMEs, like the kid who was a Spanish major that's now in the production track doing the Spanish thing. When I have a Spanish teacher holding them accountable and having actual learning objectives and a demographic in mind and things like that, it turns out way better. So that was when I got with Erik, and I was like, okay, so these SME-led projects are the best projects, no doubt, right? So I need to make a goal for GameLab of there's no more such thing as that self-sourcing SME. I need to round up SMEs. So I got super serious about reaching out to different departments and different places and people to try to drum up business, like to say, hey, we've got something to offer here. We have a product for you that you can push along your agenda. That was kind of how I positioned it. It was like, we've only got 3 months to make this thing, so we're not going to make you a full-fledged product. But what we are going to be able to make you is like a prototype of something. And I now have some evidence of that vis-a-vis like the first couple of classes, where it's like, here's an example, look at this YouTube of the final presentations. These are the style of projects they can make. And that kind of whet people's appetite a little bit, where it was like, oh, okay, so this is more than just nothing. It's not a final product, but it's actually pretty good. It gave Erik the weapon that he needed, where he's like, this is the time of the class. this is the type of stuff they can do, this is the size of the team, this is the makeup of the team. So he could go out and market that. And he actually was successful. He mentioned the VA hospital one. That was a really good early one.
Right.
Since then, we have found a lot of SMEs that are more than willing to, and have ideas that are more than willing to spend their time coming in and dealing with our students, basically for 3 months. Where if you look at the type of projects we're doing now that we're into our 5th, 6th year, whatever, it's like, these are some examples. So we have a team working with a Lake Highland Prep professor, a chemistry teacher on Tablecraft, a chemistry game. You've got an American Sign Language game that they're working with Boone High School here locally. The sign language teacher in that classroom had that. Now, that's an example where the students did have that idea internally, but they were forced as part of the class to find an external SME. They couldn't just be their own SME. So they had to find someone. That was part of if they couldn't find a local teacher or somebody that could do it, then they can't do the project, and I would distribute the students onto another team. So it's a requirement that you have an outside person. You can't do your own. Erik found a relationship with, I'm assuming it was you?
Yeah.
With this group called FLETC, Florida Law Enforcement Training Center.
Federal
Law Enforcement Training Center. They're in Georgia, so it's not Florida.
Yeah,
right?
It's not. And they're part of the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay. And they wanted a project where they wanted to look at eye tracking for officers that were driving. So a driving simulation where they could look and see how often the officers were like looking at the rear view mirrors and the side mirrors and things like that. Super interesting project. Students loved it, right? And they're using it up there. They got it installed in their stuff up there. And so they were very happy. Florida Hospital. We have a good contact down there with Roger Smith. I don't know if you guys know him, but great guy. And he wanted to do something where it's like, I want something, the laparoscopic simulations that exist right now, here's where they kind of fall apart a little bit. I want to do something maybe in VR and maybe see what the students can do with the graphical fidelity in VR, right? The beauty of these projects is it's okay if they fail, right? It's like, it's not a big deal if they found 1 or 2 interesting tidbits, but the overall project doesn't actually end up being a good final product or even maybe a good prototype. That product is a perfect example where it's like they had some really big wins in the way that they brought in a very recent addition to the Unreal Physics engine to it and then tried to use that in VR and really made some nice strides visually and how you could depict this stuff in VR and solved a lot of problems. But at the end of it all, it was like, yeah, they don't really have a good product start to finish. But some really promising stuff came out of that. Roger was ecstatic about the stuff that came out of that. So you might have looked at it and said, oh, it's too bad it didn't end up being like a full product. But the SME was super thrilled that it kind of led to a bunch of different avenues for him. We had Universal. Well, I forgot about the public speaking game. So we had a public speaking game where a Valencia professor, Courtney Lewis, he also works part-time with us, headed up, he teaches public speaking at Valencia. And they wanted to do a VR game where you get into the VR helmet and now you do a presentation. So you've got a PowerPoint, guess what? It's in VR. There it is. So you're kind of used to it. It's on your monitor in front of you. You're doing that. You could practice talk just like this. We modeled an actual room over at FIEA called The Bridge. So students would be able to practice their presentation in VR. Courtney has taken that product now, received a grant, going overseas, like blowing out that product, going to do research with that product. So that's another example. That's actually an example where you've got like a researcher that's wanting to build up a test bed. And so those have been typically very successful, is when we work directly with a researcher just trying to build a prototype that they can use to further their research. Universal was an example where an outside company, for-profit company, came in and made the students sign NDAs and said, we're going to own what you're making, so you have to sign that over, but we want to experiment around with some really cool tech for the park. And so we want to try this out with you and just see the limit of what we can do with an AR headset. Here's some ideas that we have. Try to make something like this, and then let us know about what issues you run into. What are the sorts of things you're running into? So they were looking like a year ahead, They had some prototype hardware, and they just wanted to kind of get a first glimpse at the sort of issues we were going to run into. Is it compatible with these game engines? What is it like to try to get it working? And so they generated like a white paper to say, here's the issues we ran into. So that was another really successful engagement. Finally, I'll mention a game that we did with the UCF professor, Ken Hansen, from the Department of History. He's a very interesting professor over there, does a lot of online stuff and a lot of video stuff for his class and things like that. And he really wanted to make a game that taught about, I think it was Jewish history, if I remember correctly.
Judaic studies.
Yeah, Judaic studies. And so he came over, and the students made a first-person first-person shooter, but not shooting. A first-person game where you could walk around ancient ruins and learn about different artifacts and things like that, just from the class that he teaches. And so, as part of the class, the students are required to go through that experience and see them not just in a picture, but rather in what's a simulated environment that they would show up in, that kind of a thing. So he worked hand in hand with the students, creating that environment, understanding how the characters would speak. He voiced all the characters and things like that. So again, I'm trying to give you a sense of the diversity of the style of projects that we're doing, right? It's not just medical sim, it's not just military sim, it's not just education. It's a big variety of stuff that we've found. And so, go ahead. The power in this class is the variety. No, can you go back?
Okay.
Is the variety of projects, because those projects probably seem pretty good and pretty cool and pretty diverse. That was just 1 year. So this was the next year, and it's like, somebody with medical up at FSU, adaptive immersion, doing a training system for driving drones around for Amazon training of people. Oceana, a VR, she had a score of music, and she wanted a VR experience that'll go along with it. So they worked with a music composer at UCF to do that. Delirium, we're working with the VA hospital again on a project, an AR project that simulates what a patient experiences during delirium. Right? So they want to train doctors on what it's like, so the doctors can actually get in there and see what it's like. And that was on Google Cardboard, so they could do it on your mobile phone. Really cool. Japanese language, we worked with a Japanese language instructor and did a project for intro to Japanese students that they could do that. That turned out very well. Oasis was trying to use VR to come up with some testing for the spectrum, right? Yeah. So like, right now you currently have some autism tests that act a certain way, and he was hoping to get some research money and wanted to build a prototype to say, hey, we could do this in VR possibly, and what would that look like? So early prototyping of that idea. And then finally, I had some research that I was doing for psychomotor skills and how people use controllers. And so I had a small team of 3 helping me with that. So those are the kind of diverse projects that we have. I could go back 3-4 years ago and show you those. This is just year over year. So we're, part of this is if you're a potential SME and you've got some project ideas, this is a great place to do it. It's he mentioned earlier the lockstep program. It's very strict. It's like it starts in January, ends in May, things like that. But if you've got something that, man, you could really use a team of 10 for 3 months to kind of prototype out something, this would be a great opportunity for us and for you maybe to try that. So is this the end of me?
Yeah.
Okay, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of Michael over here. So let me just a quick part of the process, right? So I'm over here in partner development. So this time of year and in the fall, I'm looking for people who want to participate. We're starting to formalize this, as you can see. And so this time of year, I'm looking for partners. Tom and I will collect. Last year we had 14 interests, 14 or 15. We vetted them down to 7 opportunities that ran in the last slide. We make our selection process right around the Thanksgiving time, so when the students start in January, they can move forward. First week that they're back here, they get started on this. We assign them to teams. Where we had talked about this as a thread is that once GameLab is finished, what's the opportunity for the students and for the faculty? Well, the students find internships. The internships have fallen out of this for different students. Some students, like like Tablecraft, have developed their own LLC. They have an SBIR. They were able to win an SBIR Phase 1 grant this year. They've got their own business going from what they did with the Tablecraft game. And Tom has students and others that are research. For some of and this brings us to Michael here in a second. For some of this, like in the VA's case, this can go to product, because the VA used the prototype that we did in GameLab as a basis for their RFP process. They distributed it around. And Michael, as a part of his organization in UCF, won that RFP and are building it. So I have one quick slide here before I hand over to Michael to talk about the value propositions of this three-way sort of student partner in UCF. For the student, they're getting exposure to other industries, they're building a portfolio, they're getting access to employers. For the partner, they're getting a MVP created with a skill base that they might not have on staff, right? They're getting to test that silly, wild-ass idea that they have on how game technology might be able to help them, and they're getting access indirectly or directly to faculty and access to talent that they might want to bring on staff when they're done. For UCF and us, it allows us, it's a vehicle for us to develop relationships. For example, this past week I had the Navy Warfare Training Center and the leadership staff for them. And I'm already getting emails from their researchers about, well, maybe we could do this. It's turning out into a wealth of ideas for how the Navy's, and it's predominantly pilot training over there, NOC TSD for anybody who's around here and familiar. This gives me tools to deepen relationship and to enhance the UCF brand, as Michael has done as well in working with the VA. Let me switch here. Come on. Bingo. Slideshow.
So I'm Mike Eakins, and I work at a lab over at the
I'm
Institute.
going to let you drive.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Okay.
The Institute for Simulation and Training. So we have many labs in that space. Ours is the Mixed Emerging Technology Integration Lab, or METIL for short, where I'm the creative director. Just a quick sampling of some of the projects, by no means representative of all of it. We do a lot of mobile training. We do a lot of job aids or just-in-time learning, that type of thing for military, healthcare, education, industry, you name it. But what I want to highlight today is definitely the app that we created for the VA. So, as Erik and Tom had alluded to, the idea was started with somebody from the VA who worked with GameLab students, created a prototype that helped them get a better understanding of what they needed. A lot of, at least from my perspective, when doing the RFP, and then eventually when we were awarded the project to kind of kick it off, all the groundwork was done. It was awesome. So we had a lot of limited pre-production that really needed to happen in terms of, well, what is it that you want? We didn't have to start there. We didn't have to kind of go back to basics. We were able to reference a student-based project that, we got the source, we checked it out, and like, oh, okay, I see what you're doing here, and it's built in the same engine, so we were able to start from there. So a lot of that stuff carries over. The interesting part about it is this ongoing relationship, this continuum that can happen with the students, right? So there's a lot of opportunity from that sort of setup. We can then take, and I think we had mentioned, hey, if the students who developed it want to help us out, they can jump on. We need support. We can do that through internships at FIEA, or when that comes up, or we've actually had for a very long time students that are coming in and out. Either they start in our lab, they've applied and gotten in through art tracks, production tracks, or they've maybe come back to UCF through our lab. So we've got one of our longest running members in our 3D team came through FIEA and then got a job with us, and he's just been amazing ever since in terms of helping us to sort of everything, and all of that experience he got from FIEA, he can now bring into the industry. We're kind of a lab that sits right in the middle, so we're not super academic. So we try to have that mindset, but we work at an industry pace. So we're kind of that applied research sort of driven development cycle. So I do want to show you a little bit about the app, so that the final result. This was developed for mobile, and it's a cleaning app. So the idea of teaching VA employees how to do this two-step process of disinfecting and working through. So again, what we did was we were able to take initial assets or game mechanics, we got the game design documents, and we can build on that. See anything highlighted or things you can interact with. Had a couple different modes of play. It's very important to follow the very specific steps and processes that were documented by the subject matter expert. And there was continuity. I believe the same subject matter expert you guys worked with is the same guy we worked with. So there was this natural bridge. All of these questions kind of came up. He knew what he needed going in. We knew what to ask, that, you know, if there was something that wasn't identified, or, hey, I see what you're going with in the prototype. Is that still what you want to do? Or maybe he pivoted based on what they found. So I think we had to adopt some different mechanics based on going to mobile versus you know, a mouse button. What are the differences? Do we want to have both because they wanted it web and mobile? So there's a couple things that came up. So you can just kind of see where we headed. The idea of being able to select an object, find the right equipment, clean, and get a score, feedback, give them sort of reporting out on what the person actually did, so that they can demonstrate that they've done this process. So just a few different things. You basically go through a whole room. So our lab has done a lot of these types of virtual environments and 3D training. So one of the cooler things, so you guys had mentioned testing out new tech. So we get to do a lot of cool stuff, like things like HoloLens. See if that should just play. Oh, good.
Operator load, resident room.
So we have we've got a lot of different AR, VR headsets. We get to do these kind of initial prototypes. We get to test stuff out. This is actually down in Lake Nona, which is about 20 minutes south of here. And it's an all-white garage. So if anybody's seen The Matrix, that idea of the construct, so using AR tech, we basically create any reality we want. So you're hearing me, it's kind of like the operator, right? That's me calling me. It's a joke. But I can load in all of these different assets. So we do a lot of different training and applications using this kind of technology, but these might be good instances in which, you know, having the students get hands-on time, our interns that can come in, work on projects like this. They're set up for industry. They get a lot of exposure. And similar to the GameLab, it gives opportunities for a lot of different researchers to test out new tech and try out new technology. And we're very science-led to the technology rather than, hey, we got a HoloLens, what problems can we throw at it, that kind of thing. So it's a whole suite of know-how. One of the other projects, again, this is a project we worked on with Boeing, so again, sort of that industry partner. So some of our students get to work on stuff like this. I can't control the volume for some reason. It's just a little loud. Try this. That's better. So this is a virtual co-pilot simulator. So using the HoloLens, we have a hybrid scenario where you have a physical cockpit, virtual co-pilot. So our students help design something that can help save on money, time, cost, all those types of things that you know, a training environment might require. So not having to pull somebody off, you know, that's an expert to be able to do some basic communication, interpersonal communication skills. So that's just a kind of a quick example of some of the things that we get to do in the lab and what our students and some FIEA get to work on. So I'm gonna pause for questions. If you guys have anything that I didn't mention you guys want to cover.
Typically speaking, after the life cycle of your project, when the project is complete, what happens?
You're talking about for me?
For anybody.
Yeah, so, you know, he gave a perfect example where they took that prototype from our class, and then the students, you know, continued their FIEA education. The VA got the prototype as part of the, you know, as part of the class, and then they went out and shopped for a grant and had money to pay them to make the real product. And so this group had a great prototype to start with. It was in the same engine. They both did it in Unity. And so to start with a working prototype, to then say, okay, what don't we like about this? And what did playtesting tell us? And what additional stuff do we need to do? That's like a best case scenario for GameLab. A worst case scenario would be an SME that was motivated and then decided not to implement and not to use it, and so then it just dies on the vine. It's like, okay, here's this Japanese language game that could be used. It's just not, but it could be. So, and I'd say we have a researcher up at UF that was working with us on research that she was doing, teaching children empathy and effective ways to teach children empathy. She made a game with us, with a large team of 14 people, teaching Russian folklore fairy tales, and then understanding the children's feelings about the different characters and how they acted with the characters. That's ongoing research that she contacts me every 3 months to thank me of how much she really appreciates this and how it's really doing. She invited me up to see the students playing it and things like that. So, prototype, what do you think, what do you use prototypes for, right? It's like, well, they can lead to bigger products. They can show that something's not feasible. They can be part of research where you don't need that super polish, right? But you just need a usable thing that somebody that knows what they're doing can use it and avoid the problems and things like that. So those are all scenarios.
So just not collect dust, have some kind of mechanism to get it out and used.
That's ideal. Yeah, but we're certainly open to the dust collection as well. It's like, it's okay. From my student perspective, it's okay that Japanese language game may never get used.
Sure.
That's not sort of part of their thinking. Those students are off making AAA games somewhere, maybe, So it's like, it was part of a curriculum. So the students learned what it was like to work with an SME. Mm-hmm. The SME got a really nice prototype. SMEs are going to vary in their ability to be able to push that forward. What if the grant hadn't gotten approved? Right. VA janitorial training might be collecting dust, because it didn't get approved or something. So it's like, we don't control that, so we don't really set that as like a measure of success. But you
like to see it being...
Would love to. Love this example. Right. Love it, right? And love the UF example. So absolutely, if I could bat 1,000 and have them all like out there, I would. But I just don't look at that as a measure of success of the class, because too many things can happen that makes a really great prototype collect dust. Sure. So I'm not going to sit there and beat myself up over a Japanese language professor that's not. I'm beating up Mihoko. I think she's using it.
Sure. But the flip side is you're not doing it just to go through the motions. You'd actually like to see.
That's ideal.
That adds an additional component to the education.
It does, where they can actually see it in use. They can see it. So yes, I agree with you. Unfortunately, go ahead.
From a partnership perspective, the additional component is opportunity for the student, right?
Sure.
I mean, from a curriculum perspective, they get to see how it's applied in real use. From a partnership perspective, I want to make sure that students have opportunities, right? And to the extent that the partner wants to extend this, creates opportunities for the students. They may or may not do it, right? But the VA was a perfect example. Leslie DeBow, who was our sponsor for both our projects, she goes, I'd love to hire Chris Vance, right? I'd love to hire Chris, but it's going to take me 6 months to get a job posting on jobs.gov to bring him in here. And then he's probably going to be bored because he's kind of by himself, right? He's not taking the talents that he learned at FIEA and immersing himself with 900 game developers at EA, right? That's so. But there's the genesis of this is all around creating partnership opportunity with the SME organization.
Yeah, and just a counterexample is when Universal came in and did that AR one I talked about, where they had the hardware that they wanted to experiment around with. Leader of that project is working at Universal in that group. Right. So it's like they got to know her and really liked the way she ran the project and ended up getting a job with them.
That's her one, right?
That's Anna Pope.
Oh, Anna Pope.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And speaking of which, I'd love to hear from each of you about what, in your eyes, makes an ideal SME. And then I'll shut up and I'll let somebody else ask questions.
Great question.
So it's a good question, and I'm actually going to launch a. This is just a side note. I'm going to launch a research project this fall, where I go back through the 6 years of GameLab, and I survey all the past students that have worked with them and get their experience, and then try to correlate somehow the type of SME with the experience of the student. So I'm going to be actively doing that, trying to present at next GDC Education Summit. That's a goal of mine. That said, I think what makes a great SME will be pertinent to that talk. And what makes a great SME is engagement, first of all. So like they're willing to spend the time, because this is like a win-win-win, but there's also a cost on all ends. And the cost for the SME is that time. And if they're unwilling to spend that time, it's almost always the case that the result ends up not very great, because they've got to spend the time. So how much time? Maybe like hour or two, once every other week, maybe. Something like that is kind of a guideline for a good amount of engagement. I have others that'll do 2 hours a week, 3 hours a week, and then I have others that, just do a check-in in the middle, and that doesn't work. So engagement on the SME is good. We're done.
Yeah, I was going
Okay.
to say, the expectation that I set when I'm recruiting SMEs is that you show up to pitch your idea at the beginning of the semester, that you're available for email and phone calls to the project lead, that once a month you kind of be here on site to review for progress review, and that you're available at the end of the semester for the final pitch. That's the expectation that I set. Again, we get varying.
Yeah.
Your results may vary, but
The other thing I think, in addition to engagement, is the notion that they come with an idea, not the very lowest SME quality is the ones that say, "I want to make a math game." Right? That's terrible. It's always a red flag for me. The best SMEs are the ones that says, "I need to teach janitorial training. Here is the janitorial training manual. We have some ideas about the way this environment could be laid out. Here's the. What do you think?" It's like, all right, let's talk. It's like that's what I'm talking about. So the more specific the idea from the SME, but they don't know about how to make this a game, but here's what they need to teach. That's success written all over it. Because then it's like, all right, the students can think about how they want to gamify this and make this into a fun thing, but ultimately you're going to be that counterbalance that says, nope, they're not learning. I'm not getting the data I need to tell that the students are empathetic. Your dialogue lines are cute, but I need this character to be nice in this way. And I need this character to be stern, and I've got the dialogue, and I'm sticking with my dialogue. And there was a battle there where the students are like, this is not fun that all the characters seem very similar. And the students wanted to diversify the characters. And the researcher was like, no, I've got the dialogue. That's not, make me a good animation of a goose. Don't tell me what they need to say. I'm telling you what they need to say. And that's exactly how it turned out, right? Is the students felt restricted by the SME, but the product ended up being effective for the researcher. Would somebody pick it up on Steam and play it? Probably not. It wasn't super engaging, right? But that was the idea of it. So that's a good SME example where they stuck to their guns and like, this is what I want to make. Too many SMEs are like, oh, just let the students do what they want to do, and that's not the experience I'm looking for. That's their other classes at FIEA. They get to do what they want to do. The whole thing of GameLab is that you don't get to decide what you're doing. You got somebody else deciding that, and you're frustrated.
Because that's how projects work.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
It's effective communication is the number one thing for me, like actively working on a project. Effective communication from your SME and with your team. However you can accomplish that, if you know your audience, but and then building on that with that goal-driven production mentality. I would add the caveat of flexibility, kind of what you talked about with being able to kind of push and pull, meeting the learning objectives, letting the experts in their respective domains do what they need to do. So my favorite relationships are the ones where my subject matter expert helps us understand exactly what needs to be accomplished, and the one that's not afraid to let us kind of give some guidance on what we know we're good at, and help meet in the middle, and so that everybody is happy and everybody gets the best product possible. Sometimes that's this kind of weird balance of chicken and egg where the SME doesn't know what they don't know, and so they're afraid to pitch a particular idea. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people where I said, don't worry about it. You just tell me what you want to do, and then I'll guide you technology-wise. Like, you don't have to worry about, well, can you do this? Don't worry, just ask. Like, we'll just pitch it. and then we'll run with it. I think that tends to be fun from that perspective once they kind of drop down their the caution of not or being intimidated by the technology, that kind of thing. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Couple of things. I was actually a FIEA graduate before the GameLab
Yeah.
started.
Cohort 7.
So this is like fascinating for me to see, and like I wish it would have existed when I was FIEA.
Me too.
I don't work in the game industry. I lasted 8 months in the AAA game industry before transitioning to more like traditional enterprise style software. And because one of the questions that I have is for these GameLab projects, how much do the students get exposure to like the end outcome of what they were building? So like if in the janitorial example, are they getting exposed to the actual humans that use the game to do the training and how effective it was for the end users, or does it kind of stop at the SME level?
It stops. Yeah, very, very little interaction there. There is some limited like play testing. So for example, in the janitorial game, they would have done a limited play test to check that their stuff is working. But we don't have any connection, any hard connection between the people that make the game. Like for example, you didn't have the janitorial team come into
Right.
your lab.
Honestly, yeah, even throughout the development
it
at
just
our level,
wasn't.
we didn't have it. I think
Yeah.
that was just a unique
But you have a
situation.
producer track though, right? Because
We do. So I think that.
could be a fit for.
Well, there's a difference, right? Where I bet you that if Chris Vance would have applied to your lab, you would have hired him.
Absolutely.
And then come in and run this project. You
Right.
have experience running the project. So I think there is definitely internship opportunities. What we don't have, and the way I interpreted the question is there like a sort of a systemic way that those students 3 months later, 6 months later, get to hear from the UF researcher that here's what the empathy testing is showing, and here's what it looks like. Come up for they've moved on. They, right after this semester, they're in summer, they're working on their capstones, they're busy. They're not going to get bothered with that product they made, and it's not for them. So no, there really is no connection between the final and even the further development of the game and the students that created it in GameLab. Yeah, there just isn't. Tablecraft is the one exception. Yeah.
It'd be good for you guys though.
It would be nice. It would be great stories, and it would also make the GameLab experience richer. Like we would have examples of. See that? Where, they thought that I was surprised at how the students really actually ended up loving this janitorial training thing. When I first heard it, I was like, are you kidding me? But they jumped right on it and did a fantastic job with it. And I bet you that they would like to see how that's going. I can imagine that. I know if I were them, I would. And that would be a great story for us to kind of legitimize GameLab fully. That it's like that, seeing that happen would be a good story, and it would further legitimize the way we're doing things.
Or even just later students coming into the program. I mean, a second group of people seeing the earlier class.
Yes.
And getting that experience, but also reviewing what they did and taking that knowledge would be useful. So
True.
even if the other current students have moved on.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
There's still real value. in
Right, right. That I could have the UF researcher come in and talk to the current students about the research that the GameLab team from 3 years ago did. They might like to hear about it. True.
I'll put one asterisk in here, being sort of the partnership business guy, is that Two-Step Clean is now being deployed to 549 VA hospitals across the country. They're in a year-long deployment. It's nice to know that as a software developer, that your product always, Andrew and I can attest to this, that your product always gets used or gets rolled out and deployed and used.
So the kind of undertone of the question was something that I didn't encounter until later in my career, where I got information from an SME, I made a decision about how to interpret and implement that, but the second step of like getting it to the field, finding out it didn't work, and then now how do I take that new information plus the old information to make the modification?
Yeah.
It's a difficult skill to pick up.
Our students are very steeped, especially since you've been there, very steeped in iteration. So we do tons of play testing on their games. Capstone really get play tested a lot. So they're very familiar with trying something, getting feedback, changing and things like that. Also, as part of the GameLab experience, it's like make a goose that's scary. And then they make something and it's like, no, that's too scary. So make it less scary in this way. What I meant was they flap their wings a little bit. And it's like, so they're getting that iteration with the SME. But you're right that there is that next level of iteration that when it gets out in the field that they're not necessarily getting, but they do get that in other avenues. We have really upped, since you were there, we have really upped the game in Capstone as far as user testing goes. So you're required to user test and report on those results and things like that. So,
Just
yeah.
All right, we've run into everybody's lunchtime. We thank you all for hanging tight. I think we were quick.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep.
Enjoy the conference.
May I have a business card?
Eric, there's no doubt Eric does. Eric's a business member.